Hello, boys and girls. We have a very sad story to tell you today. It's a story that makes us very sad and very unhappy. This story happened about 500 years ago in 1500, and it's a horrific story of what happened some people from Africa. In Africa, we were living in our country, Africa, we were living really happily. Just here, can you see the people going about their business in Africa and enjoying their lives? They farmed, they sang, they danced, they had their friends round, they played with their animals, they looked after their animals, they had festivals, they were living happily. But sometimes there were some problems. But the elders soon sorted it out. And so everybody could live happily and they shared everything they had. Nobody owned anything. Everything belonged to everybody in the village. And we shared and we lived very closely. Then suddenly, something terrible happened. We began to have problems in our villages. Bad men came. These men came from other parts of Africa. And they came to our villages and they began to steal our men. They stole the men and then the women and then the boys and the girls. We were really upset because how could this be happening? Why were they stealing them? So we waited and waited and tried to find out what was happening. But it didn't stop. Every time they came, they took more and more men and women and boys. So finally, our villages were beginning to be empty. So we followed them and we found that they were chaining the men and beating them and dragging them and pushing them towards the coast. When they got to the coast, they were very tired, they were sick, many of them were sick, many of them were very upset. Some of them tried to run away, but they chained them even more. After they sat for a while, they put them in the bottom of castles, dungeons, the very bottom. They stuffed them into the dungeons and left them in the dungeons for weeks until ships came to take them away. While they were in the dungeon, they made friends. Many of them became sick and many of them died. And they threw them into the sea. The men who looked after them were really, really horrible. They made me feel sick every time I think about it. Then ships came, galleons came from Europe. They were huge. They forced the men into the hold at the bottom, right at the bottom of the ship, packed them like sardines into the hold, as many as they could get. Sometimes 300 and 400 men packed into a very small space. These men could not move. They could not do anything. They just had to sit closely and lean on each other. They had to do everything possible there. They had to wee, they had to poo, they had to do everything. So you can imagine, it was horrible. And so many people died. And they just threw them overboard. They took them up on deck, sometimes to exercise. And many Africans jumped overboard and swam back towards Africa. Obviously, they didn't get back because they were too far away and they couldn't swim. But they were happy because they thought that once they had jumped over and swum towards Africa, even if they died, they would go back to be with their families, their animals, and their friends. So they were quite happy. But the people who were left behind were really sad because things didn't change. They got very little food and they were beaten if they said anything. And sometimes I went along among them, and I would turn myself into a little spider, and I would dance, and I would sing, and I would cheer them up, and they would smile, and then I would disappear. And then the men who came from Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, uh, Denmark, they all came and they beat the slaves, and they said, "We want you to be quiet. We don't want you laughing. Be quiet." So the slaves had to be very quiet and very still. Now here they are, forcing them into the bottom of the ships to send them to the New World. Here they are, forcing my brothers and sisters into the hold of their ships to take them away from Africa. So where did they take them? They took them from their homelands in Africa, to the islands of the Caribbean. That is Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, Santo Domingo, St. Lucia, Barbados, Grenada. They took them to Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, French Guyana, and then Brazil, all along here, and other countries in South America. They took them also to Central America. And then they took them to the United States of America, and some of them went to Canada, but mainly to the Caribbean islands. And some of them, when they left Africa, they took them to Europe, to Portugal and Spain, and then took them to the Caribbean. So my brothers and sisters were in ships for many months, and was treated very badly. Once they got to the Caribbean, men came, plantation owners, and they bought the enslaved Africans. They were taken to plantations where they grew coffee and sugar, and they were not paid a penny. They were enslaved. The Africans became enslaved. They got no money for their work. They got a little house, and they got a little bit of land to grow some food. And they were given very little food, so they had to grow things for themselves on bits of their land. And that's how they managed to survive in the cane fields. They worked in the cane fields all the time. They were not allowed to talk, they were not allowed to say anything, or else they were beaten and told to work harder. Between 12 and 15 million Africans were taken from Africa to the Americas. Many died on the way there. Many jumped overboard. Many died in the ship and were thrown overboard. When they finished working after 12 hours, they had to work on their little plots of land. They had to grow food, or else they would starve. They wouldn't be able to live, to work in the fields, because the food that the slave masters gave them was so very little. When they finished working and they had washed themselves and were preparing for bed, they would tell Anansi stories. They loved to tell Anansi stories because it cheered them up no end. They could think about the little spider defeating the slave masters, and it made them brave. And they thought about how they could fight the slave masters and free themselves. So almost every day in the islands of the Caribbean, all along here, there were uprisings. The slaves rose up against the slave masters and said, "We want to be free." In Venezuela, in Barbados, in Guyana, in Jamaica, in Mexico, everywhere where there were enslaved Africans, they rose up and said, "We want to be free." The slave masters beat them really badly and locked them up and killed the ones who led the rebellions against them. They wanted to frighten them so they wouldn't fight anymore against the masters, the slave masters. They would do exactly as they were told. But my people fought and fought. Every opportunity they got, they fought the slave masters. Then one day in Jamaica, in the island of Jamaica, there was a big rebellion. And they burnt, the enslaved Africans burnt the houses of the slave masters. They burnt the cane fields. They burnt everything inside. They burnt the barns. And the slave masters were so afraid, and their governments, that they said, "All right, we don't want you to burn anymore. We will free you." The enslaved Africans were really happy about this, but there was a problem. The slave master said, "You can work on the plantations now, but we're only going to pay you a tiny bit of money, a little bit of money." The money they paid them was so small, they couldn't really live. Some of them ran away into the mountains, and they lived there happily with their families, and they fought the slave masters. Because they got so little money from the slave masters for working 12 hours a day, they had to find other ways of living. Some who had a little bit of money bought some land in the mountains, and they planted crops for themselves and their families, and they sold them in the markets to other people. Others continued to grow food on their little plots of land and sold it in the Sunday markets to get some money. Others went abroad. They went to Panama to build the railways. They went to Venezuela. They went to Cuba. They went to lots of other countries to try and get some more work, because in the countries they lived in, the only work was working for the plantation owners and the government, who only paid them a tiny, tiny amount of money. Then in 1914, Duke Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated, and a war broke out in Europe. It was a big war, and many of the men volunteered to go and help to fight against the bad people in Europe. They went, and they were very, very brave. They fought very hard, and when the war was over the First World War was over in 1918, they went back to the islands. And again, they found that life was very difficult, but they did as best as they could. Then the Second World War broke out, and again, the people from the Caribbean islands and South America volunteered to go and fight. This time they were going to fight Hitler, because Hitler had wanted to control the whole of Europe. He attacked Poland, and then the British government decided that that was very, very bad, and so they would support Poland. Then Hitler attacked England and bombed lots of cities, lots of factories, lots of ports, lots of places in England. And he nearly won the war. But America came in, and America and Russia came and helped Britain, and they defeated Hitler and Mussolini from Italy. Then, after the war, the British government had a country that was completely ruined. It needed people to help. It asked some people from Europe to come and help. But many of them wanted to stay in their own countries and rebuild it to make it great. So they turned to the people in the Caribbean, and India, and they said, would you like to come and help to rebuild England? We want people to work driving the buses, the trains. We want people to work in the hospital as nurses and the doctors. We want people to work in the factories. We want people to work on the bridges. We want people to work everywhere. We want people to do lots of different kinds of jobs. So the people in the Caribbean, because things were not very good there, decided we'll come and help the mother country to rebuild itself. And we will get jobs and we will work for 5 years, and then we'll be able to go back to the Caribbean or to South America, and we'll be able to live happily because we will have some money to make a nice house. When they came to England, they were thankful because they had jobs, but they found that the people was not very nice to them. The people didn't like them. They didn't want them in their houses. They didn't want them in their clubs. They didn't want them in their bars. So they had to get houses for themselves. They had to buy houses for themselves. They had to have their own social club, and they had to look after each other. And while they were doing this, they told Anansi stories. They told lots of Anansi stories because, again, the Anansi stories comforted them. When they were in the Caribbean, they told Anansi stories. And now that they were in England, they also told Anansi stories. And they told it to their children and their grandchildren because the stories comforted them. And also, there was a lot of sayings in the Caribbean. When people had something that they would say, Anansi say. Anansi says, 3 heads is better than 1. Anansi says this, Anansi says that. Then everybody began to learn about Anansi. And then some people in the Caribbean wrote about Anansi in books. And the books was sent to England, and we learned a lot about the Anansi stories. And that's why we have Anansi stories today in Catford at Wildcat Wilderness in South London. Thank you, boys and girls. It's a very sad history, one that we should never forget, and one that we should make every effort to make it right again for all those people who suffered, my ancestors who suffered many, many years ago. And I'm telling you the story because it is a very, very important story. Thank you from Aso, Sister Anansi, Aso and Kweku Anansi. Thank you, boys and girls. Thank you, everybody. Bye.